Welcome, everybody. This is our first session of the series for digestive health at Cha Ching University, Washington Osher Center. For friends and colleagues who are joining us new, welcome to our series, and those who are returned, welcome back. I'm Dr. Iman Maj. I'm the director of the Osher Center at University of Washington, and today we are going to start the three-part series on digestive health. Today, we are going to talk about the how of the food and how to eat. Before introducing my colleagues and speakers for today, I would like to explain a little bit about Osher Center. The Osher Center for Integrative Health is relatively a new center at the University of Washington School of Medicine. We are in the Department of Family Medicine. We are part of a collaborative, meaning that there are 9 other centers, Osher Center across the country and 1 in Sweden. So collectively 11 Osher centers. And our goal to have a very holistic, individual-based, individual-centric well-being approach to health. These are other Osher centers across the country. Each Osher center is different in regards of services that they provide. In our center, we are actually a center without walls. We operate our clinical part out of 3 different clinics. UW Factoria Clinic, University of Washington Medical Center Sports Medicine Clinic in Ballard, and also UW PC Clinic in Northgate. The clinical services that we are offering right now are acupuncture, massage therapy, integrative medicine primary care, and integrative medicine consults. I want to take a moment to thank the Cha Ching family and also Priscilla Cho and Sonling Cho for their ongoing support with funding this series. Mr. Cha Ching was the industrialist and philanthropist from Hong Kong who actually was very committed to integrating traditional Chinese medicine and Eastern medicine into conventional medicine. And his family have been given providing funds throughout UW to support these initiatives, education in integrative medicine. And recently we have had Sonlin and Priscilla Cho Foundation, which they are also part of the Cha Ching family. They have been giving us funds to make this series available to you for public education. Today, I have 2 great speakers, my colleagues, Dr. Deborah Bell and Dr. Jason Harper. Dr. Bell is the co-director of education at the Osher Center, University of Washington. She has an extensive background in doing integrative medicine. I think it goes back to the time that there was no such term as integrative medicine. Deborah was doing integrative medicine, goes back to 40 years ago. And I can say frankly that she's one of the pioneers in this field. Deborah is currently providing integrative medicine consults and also integrative medicine in primary care at Northgate Clinic. The other colleague that I have here with me today is Dr. Jason Harper. Jason is trained in gastroenterology. He is the director of inflammatory bowel disease at the Harborview Clinic. Jason recently finished his 2nd fellowship in integrative medicine through the University of Arizona. And I'm very excited to have another physician trained in this fellowship, joining our team collectively throughout UW and helping us with these educational activities. So with that, I'm going to sign off here and hand it to Dr. Bell and Dr. Harper.
Thanks, Dr. Maj. I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping messaging before we have Dr. Harper. We'll start first. We are going to have a brief time for question and answers when we're done with our presentations, but we're going to keep the chat closed until right before that time. And then for the question and answers, you will be invited to write your questions in the chat when you see that the chat is available, and we will select as many as we can to answer at the end. The other thing is that during my presentation, we're going to do a particular exercise, and it would be ideal if you had a small piece of food, preferably something you could hold in your hand. Traditionally, this exercise is done with a raisin or a grape. Sometimes people do it with a chocolate-covered almond. But even if you just have a small square of your lunch, if you can set that aside, or if you need to run and go get it from your kitchen or something, that will be useful. If you don't have any access to any food item, that's fine. We are going to adapt. But if you do, that would be ideal. And so with that, I will pass it on to Dr. Jason Harper to begin his presentation.
Thank you very much. I am so excited to have been offered the opportunity to participate in this program. The talk I want to give is really framed around the central idea of how do we make food interesting? And the reason that's important is that interesting food, food that engages us in the act of eating, we are going to eat better. We are going to eat slower. We are going to digest better. And this has benefits to our health, both digestively and metabolically. So this is the kind of organizing principle I want to talk about, is how we use all of our senses and the setting in which we eat to make us engaged with the meal we're about to eat. The impetus for this, and I think this is a statement that would be commonly expressed by a lot of us nowadays. This is a headline from Vice News from a couple of years ago that really struck me as I was preparing this talk. It says feeding myself, but I would change the language a little bit. Why has eating become such a chore lately? I think we acknowledge, or there's a general acknowledgement, that food purchasing, food preparation already represent hurdles that we have to overcome during our sort of busy workaday hustle culture. But I'm talking about the physical act of eating has become a chore too. How often we do this in our cars on the way to work, at our desk at work. Eating is an inefficiency. When did it become this way, and how do we break these patterns? To address this, I think one has to have an understanding of this idea of food culture. And the following paragraph comes from a textbook that was written about community nutrition in the developing world. And I don't think I could say any better than they do the definition of food culture. So if you'll indulge me, try not to just read off of a slide, but I think this is a really well-written paragraph. So indulge me for a second here. Food does not only have nutritional value, it also has cultural value. Culture largely determines the food we eat, while the foods available in the environment are themselves an important building block of culture and tradition of the people. Food culture involves the way in which we use food, including how it is obtained and stored, prepared, served, to whom we serve it, how we eat it, and how people celebrate special occasions with particular foods. Food culture arises out of the place of people's origin and whether or not they still live there. It's also shaped by several other factors: resources, belief, information, ethnicity, technology, colonization, and by health status and healthcare. Talking about food culture, now I think taking a moment, if we consider our individual food cultures, because we all have our own experiences with food that are informed by these various factors. I want to take a moment, especially in the current atmosphere, to make a statement of acknowledgement that there is no monolithic, for instance, American food culture. And in fact, one of the many things that are a huge positive about living in a diverse, multi-ethnic society like we should intend to be, is that our shared food culture has been informed by all the immigrant and diaspora communities that have come together to live in this country. And this is a richness. That being said, if I was to overassume, or maybe from the outside looking in, try to define if there were such a thing as a monolithic American food culture, I don't think in that context I would necessarily have a lot of positive descriptors for it. One might even extend that to what we would consider to be the food culture of the wellness space. So what am I alluding to there? What food culture am I alluding to there? I think a lot of times we pay special emphasis when thinking about food. We think a lot about the particular types of food that we're eating. And I can certainly speak in my own clinical practice. I get a lot of questions around this. What should I be eating? And there's usually a directionality inherent to those questions, whether it's, should I be vegan? Should I try a carnivore diet? Should I eat keto? What should my macro balance be? Should I be talking about eating high fat, low carb, no carb? It's all about the what. And this extends back decades. I mean, some of you might recall older specific diets like the zone diet or the eat for your blood type of diets. This even extends when we talk about food approaches in more of a medical sphere, some of the therapeutic diets that we recommend to folks. These might include diets that are geared toward a specific digestive purpose. These might also include diets that are geared toward a certain metabolic purposes, like the DASH diet or a low glycemic index diet. But in all these cases, we're still really getting granular about this idea of which foods to include and which to exclude. But the purpose of today and subsequent lectures is to open up the apparatus, the aperture here, as to regardless of what a person's eating, the way in which they eat it has a lot to do with how that meal is going to affect them digestively and in regard to their overall health and well-being. People that understood this and have placed great emphasis on this, I think there's always something really fascinating when we engage in a little bit of perhaps comparative literature approach, shall we say, to understanding health, wellness, and medicine. This idea of the importance of how we eat has been recognized across different medical systems, some of which have been in continuous practice for millennia at this point. And so what I emphasize here is really just a very broad brush, very essentially superficial understanding of this. The first quote that I highlight here, which I admit I'm not going to try to attempt in the original Sanskrit, comes from one of the seminal texts in Ayurvedic medicine, the indigenous medical practice to the Indian subcontinent. I do not in any way, shape, or form profess myself to have a deep understanding of Ayurveda. But what I will say is that in this medical system, and you can make a similar analogy for other traditional medical systems like traditional Chinese medicine, traditional Korean medicine, traditional Japanese medicine, there is a strong emphasis on how we should be eating, what time of day, how quickly we should be eating, or slowly for that matter, the qualities of the foods in a way that with a descriptive language we don't often use necessarily in current medical parlance to describe foods that we're eating, their heating and cooling properties, whether they are oily or astringent. Anyway, back to this quote, what it basically roughly paraphrased says is that the root of human ailment is a lack of digestive fire. It's disorders of digestion. The second quote that I highlight, again, illustrating that these concepts are not new. This comes from the great medieval Jewish rabbi, philosopher, and physician Maimonides, who the statement he writes here is basically a general recommendation that after eating, we should be in a state of repose. We should be in a state of rest and not exerting ourselves. What I love about this is he also highlights something that is still relevant today that we recommend, which is that if you are eating lying down, which is part of food culture in some places, if you happen to be eating reclining, do so on your left side. We recommend this to folks that deal with, for instance, acid reflux if they happen to be a side sleeper. And we certainly do this when we're doing upper endoscopies on folks, because when one lies on one's left side, gravity is going to naturally pull the contents of the stomach to the furthest point away from where the stomach and the esophagus are going to join, thus minimizing reflux in that position. The final quote, which really sums up wholeheartedly the theme of what I'd like to convey to you guys, is a quote from Epicurus, the Greek philosopher from whose name we derive terms like Epicurean and Epicureal, who says we should look first for someone to eat and drink with before we look for something to eat and drink. Dining alone is leading the life of a lion or a wolf. I love that quote. So let's go into the proverbial meat and potatoes of what I want to talk to you guys about, which goes back to this idea of how can we engage with our food to make it interesting so that not just is it enjoyable to eat, but that naturally we're going to take our time with it. We are going to digest it better. These processes all feed back on each other. The first way is to eat with all of our senses, to really engage our sensory apparatus during the act of eating. And then from there, that naturally segues into a consideration around the concept of slow eating in general and why this is important, both for improved digestion and also downstream improvement in metabolic health by eating in a slower fashion. So let's start with our senses. But before that, I think it is worth a review of some components of digestive control and physiology. I want to say at the outset that the schema that I'm going to be presenting is admittedly, well, first of all, it was originally used to describe the phases of stomach functioning, not necessarily the digestive processes writ large. And it is an oversimplification, but it's a helpful one nonetheless. because I think it frames in a really nice way, first of all, the importance of coordination between the various components of our digestive system to function together, to function correctly. And it also highlights the importance of some of the other themes that I'll be discussing. The first traditional phase of digestion, or like I said, really more gastric secretion, gastric function, is the so-called cephalic phase of digestion. Roughly speaking, this is everything that happens before the food you're about to eat physically hits your stomach. Another way of thinking about this is that the cephalic phase of digestion brings to the forefront the fact that our brain is one of our digestive organs. So when we are anticipating through our senses that food is imminent, and particularly if it's engaging our attention, the digestive processes start to get kick-started by a two-way communication between our central nervous system and the digestive organs that's mediated through the highway that we call the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is one of the integral components of the autonomic nervous system, which is in general how our brain and central processes modulate and influence other processes occurring elsewhere in the body, like the function of the heart, the lungs, the reproductive organs, and of course, the digestive system. The sympathetic component of the nervous system is something that I think we are intimately familiar with because, quite frankly, it's on too much of the time in the modern world. I think one of the challenges, case in point, speaking for myself, is a lot of us are existing in this kind of low-level chronic sympathetic overactivity. This is our fight or flight response. And when we are in that mode of being, by definition, digestion is an afterthought. When you are engaging in a task that requires your complete attention, particularly if it's a task that puts you at mortal peril, you don't have time to be digesting your meal. Your blood, your resources are needed elsewhere. It's the parasympathetic, it's the vagal side of this system that is our rest, relax, repair, and digest function. And we want to be to start a meal. This leads to increased production of digestive enzymes, increased salivary production, and it kickstarts the motility within the GI tract. The next phase is once food essentially hits your stomach, there are receptors in your stomach that will sense the presence of that food in two ways. One is chemically. Protein, fat will be sensed in the meal that you've eaten. The other is mechanically. The stomach serves a really interesting role in the entire digestive process. It does serve some digestive functions, yes, but its principal function is as a stop valve. It's a way station for nutrients to hang out such that they can be sent along down to the lower parts of the intestine in a controlled fashion. So as a result, the stomach's chambers, it serves sort of a dual chamber role. The upper part of the stomach, which is called the fundus, is designed to relax during a meal. This is called fundic accommodation. As we eat, it is designed to gently expand like a balloon to accommodate the meal that is being eaten. Once it gets to a certain point, that's the signal usually of fullness, and if one goes beyond that, uncomfortable fullness. At the same time, the lower part of the stomach is kicking into gear like a mortar and pestle in these really profoundly strong, grinding, churning motions, the entire goal of which, in addition to the stomach acid that's there to facilitate this, is to start partitioning what you just ate into ever smaller particles that ultimately get down to millimeter increments that are periodically squirted into the small intestine. From the small intestine, there's still signals that are being sent upstream. And largely the way I would describe this phase is when nutrients get into the small intestine, they work backwards to say, hold on, give us a second. Let us deal with what you just gave us before you send more on down the line. Let us neutralize that stomach acid. Let's start to work on the components of the nutrients that you gave us. And all of these components that I'm mentioning from top down are working in concert simultaneously. It's a really beautiful and complex ballet, if you will, of coordination between the digestive system to help this operate efficiently. As you can imagine, there's also a lot of ways, hence what frankly keeps my office open and others as well, where this can go sideways. So now with that said, let's go back to one of the central themes here, which is how do we use our senses to engage us in the eating process? And hopefully by so doing, optimize those same processes that I just mentioned. So sight, let's start with this one because this is so essential and integral in a lot of ways to how we eat. I'm going to put a plug in here for any of you who are looking for a really fascinating read. There's a wonderful book called Immense World by Ed Yang, who's a science journalist. And this book is about how both human beings and our brothers and sisters in the animal kingdom, how we experience the world through our senses. I think there's a certain feeling, I think, that we humans sometimes drew the short end of the stick when it came to our animal cousins, with the exception of our big brains, right? We didn't get the strength or the speed or the claws or what have you. And these kind of things, this dates back to antiquity, these kind of stories. But it actually turns out that there's certain things that we do beyond just having big brains that humans do really, really, really well compared to other animals. While we might not have the olfaction of a dog or the ability to taste the air in the way a snake might, human beings have exceptional visual acuity, some of the best measured in the animal kingdom. So our ability to break down a visual scene is remarkable. And we do this when we're presented with food. And this will either engage or disengage us from the meal we're about to eat. If you need any proof of this, the people who understand this very well are people in the food industry, people in the culinary industry, and to some extent, people in the pharmaceutical industry. You might wonder out loud, what purpose adding artificial colors to prescription medications serves? But it's because certain colors subconsciously, unconsciously associate themselves with certain reactions you can provoke from individuals. There's a body of literature around this, at least in terms of how eating behavior, speed of eating, and amount of eating are influenced by some of these visual characteristics. One example, and this isn't meant to be universal because there's going to be different reactions to different things on an individual level. But broadly speaking, for instance, when the color red is used as a contrast for like a serving dish that something is on, it generally has somewhat aversive tendencies to want to eat the meal that's being served on that very strongly red colored plate. On the flip side, white, very light colors tend to enhance the gustatory experience of sweet foods, whereas very dark colors seem to do so for savory foods. Another example of how our sight influences our feeding behavior is that our eyes are drawn to visual areas of presence and void. We pick out the voids and we pick out the substance in the tableau in front of us. And so as an example, when presented with the exact same quantity, amount of food, calories, and everything else being equal, if served on a serving platter where there is more empty void space, in general, people will eat quicker and they will perceive themselves to be less satiated by the same meal served with less empty space. Taste. This is a, if you will, bad pun incoming. This is a little amuse-bouche for some of our future talks, where I'm going to talk a little bit more about the fascinating sense of taste. Taste, despite having been recognized as one of the primary senses ages ago, into antiquity, is and remains one of the most poorly understood primary senses. We worked out decades ago the basic mechanics of vision, hearing, even smell. Olfaction was worked out quite a while ago. It was only within the past 5 to 10 years that scientists have definitively identified some of the human taste receptors. So we're still working this out, but taste is a very basal sense. If you consider how very simple organisms perceive the world around them, it's almost exclusively through essentially taste, through chemical sensation. For a couple of just brief points I want to make about taste while reserving some of the intricacy of what the individual tastes do to our digestion, is the idea that we have found taste receptors now throughout the body. They're clearly not just on the tongue. There's taste receptors throughout the GI tract. There's taste receptors in the lungs. There's taste receptors in the central nervous system. There's taste receptors in the reproductive system. So these are not unique to just our conceptualization of taste, aka what goes into our mouth. The 5 classic tastes that have been identified with receptors that correspond to them are, of course, sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. But there's also multiple other candidate tastes out there that are still being worked out, like an actual taste to fatty substances. Another thing we'll talk about in future lectures is the specific role, these aren't quite tastes, but that receptors that sense a perceived temperature in the GI tract, spicy sensation, cooling sensation, that these have direct effects on digestion and very interesting properties. To summarize how we, though, might use taste in a broad sense to affect our digestion and to improve our ability to engage with our food, the first thing I can't emphasize enough is to provide a wide palette of tastes in the same meal to engage all the different taste receptors. Some of the taste receptors, understandably, are more reward driven, and some are more aversive. And it makes clear sense which are which. If we actually bring in, though, for instance, often neglected tastes into our mixed meals, bitter in particular, the activation of bitter taste receptors does some really interesting things. Like I said, a little teaser for future discussions, does really interesting things to our digestion and to our metabolic health. But these are also tastes that we unfortunately do not incorporate very frequently in our meals, partly because there's an aversive tendency toward them. And also it gets back to this idea of what meals we're consuming. What is our food culture? What are the tastes that we are integrating? So I'll just leave it at diversity of tastes within a meal has positive effects on how we experience the meal, but also the pace at which we eat it and the digestive properties of the meal. More to come later. Smell, olfaction. It goes without saying, but I'll say it nonetheless, that what we perceive as flavor, when we talk about the flavor of a meal, we are really talking almost exclusively about the odor of the meal. It is our sense of smell that comports all flavor to what we're eating. Anybody who has experienced temporary loss of smell can speak to this. As an aside, one of the things that I found really so singularly unusual, frankly, with my experience with COVID as an example, was the disconnect between not being congested, having no nasal congestion, and being completely unable to smell anything. And vis-a-vis food took on this really odd and frankly unpleasant dimension when it was robbed completely of flavor. One of the points I want to make here too about the importance of engaging flavor when we eat is that in order for food to be rewarding and palatable, if you are missing the positive signals of flavorful food, you're going to make up for that with other reward-driven pathways to encourage you to eat that food and make it palatable. In general, and unfortunately, especially when we're talking about heavily processed food, this means really leaning into sweet and salty tastes. It's the only way we can get that food to be palatable. Because when you think about it, the flavor of those types of foods tends to be very homogeneous and very one note. Versus if you bring a more complex array of flavors to a meal, it is going to increase the positive experience of the meal without having to lean so much on more basic things like heavily sweetening it and or making it very salty. Touch, fundamental sense right here. How food feels in our mouths, the mouthfeel of food has a lot to do with the pace at which we eat it and vis-a-vis some of the downstream effects that we'll talk about in just a second. Summing this up, the way to keep food interesting is to mix textures within the food, to have a more so-called complex mouthfeel. When you include, especially in an already soft textured food, some elements that are going to require you to chew, it stands to reason you are going to slow down the pace at which you eat. As with most things in life, too much of a good thing is not good. At the extremes of textures, food that is over hard, food that is just completely slimy as experienced, these often tend to be aversive phenomena. And if it's aversive, you're going to eat it faster if you have to. Temperature affects how we digest. Temperature specifically affects how quickly or slowly things exit the stomach. And this has been demonstrated in a number of really thoughtful studies. I would summarize what the directionality of these studies suggests as the idea that food at the extremes of temperature tends to disrupt the orderly flow out of the stomach, in particular, very, very cold liquids. So think again, when you're talking about consuming a mixed meal, when I say mixed meal, I mean something where there are solid components and liquid components. Warm but not hot foods facilitate exit out of the stomach in a positive direction. When you combine that with a very, very, very cold beverage, you're dropping the overall temperature of the contents within the stomach. In general, that's usually going to tend to delay stomach emptying and not typically in a positive sense. So let me then finish with the last few slides, which is a nice segue into some of the exercises that you'll be doing with Dr. Bell. I keep coming back to this theme of make food interesting so you eat it slower. Why? Why does it matter to eat things slower? What what benefits accrue from this. There's a couple of arenas in which eating food slower offers directly measurable benefit to our ability to digest that food. So I'm going to talk you through a couple of these, starting with the importance of chewing. And at the outset, there's no mystery here. I recall over the years hearing things like you're supposed to chew your food, I don't know, 20 or 30 times before you swallow it, which frankly, some foods, if you've kept in your mouth for 30 chews, they will have dissolved into nothing by that point. So the idea here, though, is just to underscore that the basic act of chewing, this chewing and swallowing for that matter, these subconscious processes that are just remarkable in terms of the amount of coordination that needs to take place between your brain and your swallowing apparatus. It's phenomenal that this happens as relatively easily as it does. As you chew, you are starting the digestive process in the mouth. Saliva contains digestive enzymes, which are already going to start breaking down sugars and fat in the meal that you're eating. While in general, this isn't the integral or essential component of the human digestive process, it turns out that in individuals who, for instance, lack digestive enzymes lower down in their system from the pancreas, the enzymes that are found in saliva and in the stomach pick up a substantial amount of the slack of breaking down nutrients higher up. The longer you chew, the more time and exposure there is for this to happen, because the moment these enzymes from your saliva hit the stomach, they're inactivated by stomach acid. But they'll still keep doing their work if they're protected within the saliva, which neutralizes to some extent that acid. Saliva, we're going to talk about on another side. Could keep going on and on about saliva. It's magical stuff. Another benefit to longer chewing is that when you chew for a longer period of time, you tend to swallow less air overall in the act of eating. We all swallow air when we eat. It's a natural phenomenon, but some individuals are prone to doing this a lot more and or are quite sensitive to the effects of swallowed air, which can lead to a lot of reflux, belching, or uncomfortable fullness after eating. Eating slower and chewing more thoroughly does help mitigate that. All right, saliva. I love highlighting parts of the body that we give such short shrift to, unless perhaps you've ever experienced a lack of this, and then you will know firsthand how important and amazing saliva is. We produce over 1 liter of this a day, and saliva does so many things. I already mentioned it participates in the digestive process. Saliva also contains a number of antibodies and antibacterial proteins that maintain the health of our oral microbiome. For all the attention that the gut microbiome has deservedly gotten of late, we are still scratching the surface of understanding the health of the oral microbiome, not just for general dental health, but for systemic health writ large. I was talking about the importance of taste. Saliva is a necessary component of fully tasting a meal because all the taste receptors, the molecules that activate them, have to be dissolved in a watery solution, aka saliva. Saliva coats and protects your esophagus from damage from acid reflux. Could go on and on. Saliva is an integral component of our digestive process, and the more we chew and the more excited we are about eating the meal, the more saliva we will produce. So, some easy hacks to try to get yourself to chew a little bit more. I already mentioned one, and I'll go back to it. Mix up the textures of the food that you eat. Move food around your mouth as you're eating. Use your whole mouth. Some of the other stuff here I'm just going to let you read because I think it's fairly straightforward, and it's frankly a lot of stuff I knew. I heard a lot of growing up, and there's a reason why. It makes intuitive sense, and it actually does improve our digestion. The act of eating slow, I'm going to make an absolute statement. And those of you who either know me or who have worked with me in clinic know that I'm not a fan. I love to hedge my bets. I don't like to make absolute statements. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, I cannot think of a single benefit to eating quickly for any medical condition, GI or otherwise. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's not times where we might want, especially for certain GI conditions, people to be eating foods that might empty out of their stomach a little faster if that's something they have trouble with. But I'm talking about eating quickly. Because in those same individuals, if anything, eating slower is even more important to give them time to allow what's already been put into the stomach to make its way out. Versus almost all of us would benefit from better coordination of these functions of moving nutrients from one compartment of our system to another. And a lot of the chronic digestive issues we see in gastroenterology, I could be talking about irritable bowel syndrome, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. There's often some element of these that is due to a mismatch in the timing of when food nutrients are moving from one compartment to another. There's also been studies that have shown that people who are self-described fast eaters have higher concordant rates of some of these same digestive disorders. Now, granted, this doesn't demonstrate that necessarily there's a causal relationship. It's not as though fast eating necessarily causes these. This might be adaptive, but suffice to say, I go back to the central tenet. I can think of no benefit to eating rapidly. That also extends to metabolic issues. Pardon. Rapid eating can overwhelm the ability of the body to naturally regulate the expected post-meal spike in blood sugar. That also is something that requires a lot of intrinsic coordination, and we can overwhelm that mechanism if we eat too quickly, particularly foods that are also dumping into the intestines too fast. A great way to slow down how we eat and derive more pleasure from eating harkens back to that quote earlier on about eating, finding a person to eat with before even thinking about what you're going to be eating. Social eating can manifest all of these benefits. It also generally, of course, if you're talking about a contentious, maybe Thanksgiving with that one family member you happen to get stuck sitting next to, okay, maybe my analogy is not going to hold water. But in general, when we eat in a social setting, in addition to a slower pace, we ourselves are more relaxed. There's conversation. We're talking, we're sharing in between bites, talking in between bites, not while we have food in our mouth. If there's any downside to social eating, it has been shown that, understandably so, that social eating environments, the one negative is they do tend to lead to increased alcohol consumption. But I think that hopefully the directionality of a lot of our conversations around how, if we choose to do so, how we incorporate alcohol in our life would allow for a certain decoupling of the expectation that every time we share a meal with other people, it has to be some big event like a dinner party or going out to a restaurant, and that alcohol is an obligatory component of that experience. This can extend to even just our lunch breaks, finding somebody to sit and share a meal with. The last slide I have here before I turn it over that I want to end with is that in the process of putting this together, I realized that as important as a lot of these things are, talking about slow eating, talking about making food interesting and flavorful and delightful to look at, as important as these things are, we don't right now often have a broader food culture that encourages this. In fact, in many ways, it actively discourages it. And so, to whatever extent we can, I think if we find these things important, as I suspect many of us, myself and many of you listening do, we need to find ways to advocate in our own spheres for incremental changes that allow us to eat slower and to really emphasize the importance of this in our day-to-day life. Happy to kind of field some thoughts or questions around that later on, but I want to make sure that I'm not going too much further over than I already have. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Dr. Harper. That was awesome. This is going to really segue from what Dr. Harper was talking about all of these components. And to me, the question is, well, how do I do all of that? Like right now, I don't do that. Like it's not that easy to change. And so the notion of mindful eating and mindfulness practice is a means for us to begin to engage in some of these important components about how to eat. So first, Dr. Harper talked about the senses, and the first thing is we have to pay attention. So how many times do we really not taste our food? We don't really look at it before we put it in our mouth. We really have no idea. We're just not paying attention at all. And the notion of mindfulness is about how do I begin to pay attention? How do I direct the attention of my mind to these things that are in front of me? Whereas so often we're so distracted by everything else that eating is just something that's happening and we're really not paying attention at all. We're not paying attention to where we are, who we're with, what the food is, how much we ate. There are many times when people just look at their plate and it's empty and they don't really even remember eating it. So the notion of mindfulness practice and eating mindfully is beginning to pay attention to all of these things, the senses and the things that Dr. Harper was mentioning. What we eat, how much we eat and when we eat, right? So the what we eat, we have the talking about eating the rainbow, and we're not talking about rainbow sprinkles. We're talking about eating the rainbow of vegetables and the color of our food that are not artificially colored sprinkles on our donut. How much? Same thing I said before. We can have food in front of us and it's gone. So we ate 4 pieces of pizza and we don't even remember, versus we have this beautiful plate. Again, Dr. Harper talked to us about using a lot of times using small plates. It's interesting over time, the size of the dinner plate now is much larger than the size in the 1950s. And so using a luncheon plate for your meal allows your mind to realize, again, if we're paying attention, that this is plenty of food. And if you put the same amount of food on a big plate, your mind thinks that it's not enough and you add more than maybe what your body needs and wants, particularly for your digestion. And then when we eat, a lot of times people eat because it's their lunch break and it's not when they're hungry, or perhaps they eat right before they go to bed. And if we pay attention, we might notice, gee, when I eat before I go to bed, it's not so great for my digestion. Gee, when I eat when I'm not hungry, just because it's the time I'm supposed to eat, I don't feel as well. So again, this is this noticing of what and how much and when, and then, as I said previously, the senses. So I just want to take a moment here because I do want to have plenty of time for question and answers, and I want to do our exercise. But I'd like for you to take a moment, and before you think about it, before you do it, I'd like for you to reflect. This is part of this paying attention. And see if you have a means to write this down, you can, or you can just think about it. See if you can remember everything you had to eat in the last 3 days. And if you're like, oh, forget that, then what about yesterday? And really everything that passed your lips. And this is a really great exercise in mindful eating because it helps us to recognize different kinds of things and ways and the how, what, and when of eating that we just don't pay attention to. I've had so many people that I work with who do this, and they say, oh my gosh, I never realized how much candy and snack and processed food I actually eat when I'm at work. I always think I'm just taking one thing out of the candy jar, but when I pay attention, it's actually 10 times. Or, oh my goodness, I totally forgot that I skipped a meal and I didn't have any lunch, and then I had a headache later. Maybe that was why. So this is a great exercise for not judgment or punishing ourselves, but to help us to actually be able to pay attention to what our patterns and behaviors are around eating and how it might have an impact on our health overall, and particularly our digestion is the topic for today. So mindfulness, as I said, is a practice. And I have 3 quotes here for people who were sort of pioneers in bringing this to the general public in the Western world. Now, it's important to recognize that mindfulness practice is something that has been part of different kinds of cultures and spiritual practices for thousands of years. It's not a new concept. It's just that embracing it and its importance and describing it and how it fits with our current modern culture is something that's been going on sort of since the 60s and 70s in the Western world. And Jon Kabat-Zinn, who began to do some research in the 80s and developed what's called mindfulness stress reduction technique, uses these words to describe mindfulness practice. Paying attention on purpose. We're actually intending to pay attention in the present moment. Again, what's happening right now in front of us versus all the other distractions in our mind. And then importantly, non-judgmentally. This is not about that we're doing something wrong. And we know that the mind is much more willing to pay attention to something if there isn't a negative approach from our mind. The University of Arizona Integrative Medicine, which is where Dr. Harper did his fellowship and also one of the pioneers of training medical professionals in integrative medicine, describes mindfulness, again, as this deliberate, right? We're doing it on purpose, non-judgmental, paying attention of the experience that helps us with self-awareness, maladaptive thinking, and again, helping us to reduce suffering by recognizing these things. And then Bear, who did quite a lot of research on mindfulness practice, again, you can see these same themes, observation, non-judgmental, and looking at the things that are both in our mind as well as external. So again, we use this term mindfulness practice. The idea of practice is the same thing that we would do if we were learning an instrument or doing a sport or studying for a test. It's practicing so we are learning certain aspects so that they can become more of something that we use on a regular basis. And paying attention and being mindful is not something, particularly in our busy culture, that we necessarily do very often. And so we do these exercises that are practices helping us to become familiar with what it means to pay attention and observe. And again, do it in this framework of it being from a non-judgmental perspective. So there is a little bit of misinformation that mindfulness is this way of creating a relaxation or, quote, quieting our mind. And in fact, it's not that at all. It's just an exercise, and an exercise for our mind to begin to help to filter out some of those distractions so that we can pay attention. So we're going to do a mindfulness practice, and I wanted to start with what the basic rules are. And again, the basic rule is that there are no expectations. This is not a result. There isn't something that's going to happen from the practice. We're not going to have some kind of epiphany. It is a process, and it's this process of practicing. The other thing is that you can't do it wrong. So if the whole time during your practice you are distracted thinking about what you're going to do next, or when is the timer going to ding, or when is it going to be over, if you notice that that is what you were doing during your practice, then that was your practice. Or for people who fall asleep. So anything that happens in the practice, if you notice what that is, then that was your practice for the time. And then lastly, the importance of non-judgmental. The whole point of this is coming from a place of self-compassion and being kind to oneself, and not that there is, I do this bad thing. And I think that's particularly true around beginning to practice mindfulness of eating, so that we gradually have these changes to begin to notice things, so that we can begin to have practices around eating, as Dr. Harper described, that help to aid in our digestion. So I'm actually going to turn off my video here so that I am not a distraction. And I'm going to lead us through a brief mindfulness practice exercise. And now is the time that if you do have this small food item, you want to have it near you, because we're going to use it. So I'm going to turn off my video here. Maybe I can. Maybe I can't do that when I'm screen sharing, so that's fine. So I'd like for you to allow yourself to first just be in a comfortable position. Notice your head and neck and spine are aligned. They're comfortable. Your arms and legs are in a position that feels just right for you. And draw your attention to the fact that you're breathing. For just a few moments, become aware of the movement of your breath as it enters your body and as it leaves your body. Continue to notice your inhalation and your exhalation. And if you've closed your eyes for this moment of paying attention to your breathing, I now invite you to open your eyes and take just one of the food objects that you have near you. Just one. And if you don't have something, then I'd like for you to close your eyes and imagine one piece of food, and use your imagination that you are doing all of the things in this mindfulness practice that you might do if the food was actually in front of you. So see if you can entertain the notion that you are seeing this object for the very first time. And with that in mind, look at it. What does it look like? What is its shape? What color is it? You can pick it up and put it in your hand and look at it very carefully. Do you see any imperfections in this food? Anything that looks unusual? And now that you've looked at the food, investigate it more closely by touch. And again, for touch, if it helps you to close your eyes, please feel free. How does this food item feel in your hand? What is its temperature? What's its surface like? What's its texture? Is it heavy or light? How does it feel when you touch it? And now, consider bringing this food item up to your nose. Do you smell any fragrance of the food? Are you noticing that you're beginning to salivate? How do you feel about putting this food in your body right now? What do you notice about your body as it anticipates eating in this moment? And now, slowly, allow yourself to receive this food into your body in a mindful way. Be aware of your arm moving up towards your mouth. Notice how the food feels against your lips when you place it in your mouth. Experience the feeling you get as it rolls around and moves in your mouth. And when you feel ready, if you haven't already, start to chew slowly. Focus your full attention on the food's taste and texture. Be aware of any desire you have to rush through eating this food so that you can take another bite, or you can be finished and move on to the next thing. Be aware of your intention to swallow before you actually swallow. And as you begin to swallow, notice how the food gets to the back of your throat to be ready to go down. And when you're ready, swallow and follow this food mindfully as it travels down to your digestive system. And now bring your attention back to your breath for a moment. Notice your body sitting in your chair. And when you're ready, come back to the space of the group. Okay. So that was an example of a mindfulness exercise around mindfulness of eating. And some people actually do this exercise of just having a meal that is an intentional, slow eating meal. You can do it with other people, but you don't talk. You just pay attention to your food and eating and chewing, and you do it as an exercise. There are many, many other mindfulness practices that we can do that are not specific to eating. And we may find that over time, when we do those exercises, that we begin to find that we can pay more attention to all of these factors about how to eat that have been described. So I'm going to bring Dr. Harper back in, and if our staff could make it so that he can be unmuted. And there should be now a capability to begin to put questions in the chat. And we'd be happy to answer questions that we see in the chat. And in the meantime, while we are waiting for questions to come in, I want to again encourage you that when you log out of Zoom, you will be given an evaluation form for our project, and we would really appreciate it if you would fill that out. And also that we have 2 more things coming up, one in March and one in April, one about functional foods and one about irritable bowel syndrome and addressing it from an integrative approach and the low FODMAP diet. So I see a question here that Dr. Harper, you mentioned a book. Could you repeat the title?
Yep, it's Immense World by Ed Yang. It's a great, it's a quick read. And it's like what I like to consider like an airplane book or a beachside book, and it's just fascinating, just fascinating. And there's some really, really, really good questions. Let's take the next one. What do you think, Dr. Bell? What thoughts do you have about eating at different times of the day? And the funny thing is, we kind of wondered if we might incorporate it. There's so much to cover. And maybe it'd be a good topic down the line around sort of time-restricted eating. But what are your thoughts broadly?
Yeah, so I think that first, as someone who has been dedicated to integrative medicine for so many years, that we always have to remember that it's about the individual. And so there isn't just one prescription of what's the right time of day. There are going to be many different factors. But in general, for digestion, that when we are moving about, needing energy, it's best to be eating during those times. And our culture tends to wait until the end of the day and then we lay down. So I think that those are sort of the big things. And to me, I would say that there's quite a lot around metabolically what might be good for the time to eat. But in terms of digestion, I think a lot of that has to do with the individual and what foods you're choosing to eat. And Dr. Harper, I don't know if you want to add on that.
Yeah, I'll segue. It's interesting. There's only an emerging body of literature around, say, time-restricted eating for folks with irritable bowel syndrome. And what little data there are, and I'm hoping that we're going to get a lot more, would suggest that there might be some benefits to certain patterns of time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting for irritable bowel syndrome. But one does have to be careful because the directionality of that is that often food is a trigger for symptoms in folks with digestive conditions. And so they can very understandably entrain this idea, well, if I don't eat, my stomach doesn't hurt, so therefore I will stop eating. One has to be careful if you're employing time-restricted eating patterns, that exactly to your point, you individualize it to the patient, and that the idea is not to normalize food avoidance, but rather talk about ways that the foods you're already eating, the time of day you're eating them, may make some difference in how you feel after the fact. Let's see. Do you want to take the next one? Take a question? There's so many good ones.
Yeah, well, I can answer the one about resetting your taste after COVID. I think that a lot of that has to do with retraining, and this has to do with the gut-brain and the sort of mind-body connection. And so we can retrain our sense of smell first. And there are some strong scents that are often used for retraining: cinnamon, coffee, vanilla. Those are the 3 biggies that I know of. And you actually just make yourself smell those several times a day. And oftentimes when you start with the olfactory part, the taste begins to follow after your sense of smell comes back. And there's been quite a bit of research since COVID about olfactory retraining. And it generally, people have at least some improvement and success with that over time.
Thank you. I'm going to take the one because I do want to clarify. So always been told that walking after a meal aids digestion, but you mentioned that a stroll after eating can be harmful. That was more Maimonides saying that, not Dr. Harper. I'm gonna put a little asterisk because I actually do think a gentle stroll after a meal can be very nice. It can help you feel a bit lighter. So there's this interesting phenomenon where, and we see this in the hospital all the time, chronic inactivity also slows down digestion. When we see people who are in the hospital laying in bed for hours on end, it's really remarkable how much their digestion slows down. They can consume an object that will remain in their stomach for 12 hours without moving because they're just lying on their backs doing nothing and then sleeping like that too. So what I would say, and I would stand by this, is that light activity is fine, but if you eat a big meal and then go for a run, and I can speak to this, like you're not going to feel great. You're not going to feel great. But going for a nice stroll, ideally with maybe a friend, maybe a pet, like by all means do that. I do think that can be very nice, especially after a larger meal. But no, I wouldn't, go do heavy training right after a big meal. The other one that I go back and forth on is heavy exercise before you go to bed. You'll also hear discrepancies about that. A lot of people will dissuade people from doing like really rigorous exercise before bed. Guilty as charged, I do, and it actually helps me get to sleep at night. So pick your.
Well, I'm dating myself for this, but when I was a kid, particularly in the summer, and you had a picnic, and everybody then wanted to go swimming in the ocean or the pool. My parent would always say, like, don't go swimming, you're going to get a cramp. you have to let yourself digest first. So I think that, again, in terms of ancient wisdom, there is something to that, but there also is something to standing up, moving around, taking a stroll. I think there's also that sense of community and setting. When we think about some of the cultural diets, like the Mediterranean style diet, for which the culture is a part of it, that actually when you engage and you get up and you move and you engage with other people, you actually will also probably eat a volume of food that's a little bit more appropriate. Whereas if you just keep sitting, you just keep putting more on your plate and you may not be paying attention to when you're full.
So think less Thanksgiving dinner, more lunch with friends. Like, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I like this one. Is it better to drink water at room temperature? What do you think, Dr. Bell?
Well, I know what the Chinese medicine people would say, which is yes. And I think that the super cold, ice cold water you already spoke to, and again, that's come into our culture, right? When you sit down at a restaurant, what do you get? You get ice water, and exactly. I think that the servers don't give me quite as much of a look when I say I'd rather not have ice, please. And so I think that super, super cold really is not good for our digestion. And in general, room temperature is probably better. And some people do need to train their palate for that.
Could not agree more. I'll share a funny anecdote that when I was growing up, my mom would always ask for, like, we would go to a restaurant and she'd always ask for a glass of like lukewarm water with a lemon slice. And we used to tease her mercilessly for this. And she was totally onto something, because that's actually a lovely way, little bit, get that sour punch. It's a lovely way to start priming the palate for the meal without necessarily filling up on a bunch of water beforehand.
There's a question about certain categories of food in a particular order. And Dr. Harper, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
That's a good one. I actually, if whomever asked it has some wisdom to share with the group, I
am not aware of that, and from either a digestive or a metabolic perspective, and certainly from sort of a traditional Western scientific perspective, I don't think we have that information, and I'm not aware of. There may be some things around cultural and other ancient wisdom forms of eating. I certainly know that the temperature of the food, like in Ayurveda, there are some people who really should be eating cooked foods or warm foods, that there are some of those things regarding digestion and health, but actually, eat your vegetables first and your, rice later. I'm not aware of that. And again, I'm very respectful of the wisdom of ancient people figuring things out. And most of those kinds of things over time were combined foods. And so
I think that's a really, yeah, because I mean, I think that this gets back to trying to disengage from dogmatism in general around like there's a one way to do this. Because to your point, I think that when you have a mixed meal and you're eating the components sort of in a round robin fashion, intuitively, I'd like to think that that actually makes for just a more pleasurable experience versus just, eat my protein first, then my starch, finish with the veg. If I was going to say anything, I'd say eat the veg first. Somebody else just pointed this out too. Eat the veg first, because it's definitely true that different food components will affect your satiety signals differently. That is absolutely true. So fibrous foods in general are going to promote satiety signals. They're going to expand volume in the stomach, and they're the last bit to leave. So the last part of the meal, what the way the stomach works is like you're basically right. You get all the easy stuff gets through first, and the very last part, there's usually, if you've eaten a mixed meal, there's going to be this kind of bolus or chunk of undigested plant matter, the roughage, so to speak. And the very last thing the stomach's going to do is it's going to essentially, whatever's left over, it's going to heave out down the way. So you can get that sustained fullness with the fibrous foods. It's not going to impair or hamper the ability, though, of the stomach to take care of all the other nutrients that you put in. The other thing about the digestive system that's really remarkable, the more you dive into it, is there's a lot of implicit and intended redundancy in the system. It knows what to do really, really well if given the opportunity.
yeah, and no one else, a couple of other people did comment on that. And we had a question about the reduction of stomach acid with age. And I mean, the one thing I would say about that is back to chewing and whether or not we eat raw foods or cooked foods in terms of what our stomach needs. And sometimes there are some things like putting lemon in your water during the day and things like that are part of eating and not necessarily supplements that we do. And
I think there's a
I don't know if you have anything else you want to add.
Oh no, I think even highlighting that is really great, because there's a lot of things that we give short shrift to about how our digestion naturally changes as we age. If I go back to, for instance, the sensory stuff that we were talking about, I mean, by definition, our senses become, especially some of these primary gustatory senses, become less acute as we get older. That is 100% a natural phenomenon. Production of stomach acid often, not always, often tends to decrease with age. There's elements of that too. Directionally, that's true, but there's also elements of that have a lot to do with concurrent factors, in particular, the rate or lack thereof of things like concurrent Helicobacter pylori infection in the background of a population, because that often tends to, in and of itself, lead to reduction or hypochlorhydria of stomach acid over time. But I think that it harkens back to this idea that you also pointed out, that our digestion is going to change through different phases of our life, but some of these truths remain universal in terms of how they can help us with what we've got. Yeah.
Okay. That's great. I think those are the main questions. I think we covered most of them. Yeah, someone commented about order with a diabetic diet. Again, even with that, metabolically, I think what foods you group together, but really the time frame of I'm eating something first for 5 minutes and then something else, that really, I don't know, other than the having your salad or roughage ahead of time in terms of satiety and not overeating.
A lot of that comes down to trying to match the timing of gastric emptying to the intestinal component, which we've now, part of the oversimplification is when these original models were come up with, they hadn't even necessarily identified all of the incretins that we know about now, like GLP-1, for instance, right? Big, that's a hot topic.
For those of you who don't know that term yet, that's the, Wegovy, semaglutide, all the medicines that people are using for weight loss.
These are intestinal hormones that are secreted during the digestive process to prime the rest of the body, like, hey, sugar is coming, get ready to deal with it. And I think yet another unfortunate manifestation of the problems we have with processed food, and frankly in particular, is it just gets turned directly into sugar super duper fast. Thoughts on plant-based versus see, this is what we like, right? Like this is the what, and I don't mean to make like those are thoughts on plant-based diet versus Mediterranean. I mean, those are both on paper and in theory excellent sustainable dietary practices, whether you're talking about purely plant-based or purely plant-forward. But there's, the Mediterranean diet, I think, I'm always, when I'm talking to my own patients about this, careful to point out that that's an abstraction, right? I mean, there's multiple traditional dietary patterns that incorporate the same philosophy and are very healthful. The Mediterranean diet is one that we've appropriately glommed onto because there's a lot of data to support its use, really good data. But you can extrapolate the principles in a lot of different directions. What do you think? Plant-based, Mediterranean?
Right. And I think that the important thing is that plant-based can be very sort of strict as a vegan diet, but the Mediterranean, we really do use this term plant-forward quite a bit now. And the Mediterranean diet is a plant-forward diet. So both of those things, where the majority of your foods is from plants, are considered to be most healthy. And there's some about that with regards to digestion, and that animal products are harder to digest. But there's a lot of other things with regards to inflammation and health. So I see that our time is wrapping up here, and I want to thank everyone for all of their attention. And please join us, tell other people about it. And if you want to refer someone for to hear this talk, it will be on our OSHA website and recorded. And we, again, really would appreciate your feedback. And the other thing that Dr. Maj didn't say that I will put a plug on is that at our OSHA Center website, there is also a place that says how to donate. And we are, have an endowment, but a lot of the work that we do like this are from gifts from people. And so if you or anyone is interested in helping to support all of our various efforts, we would appreciate that greatly. And with that, thank you very much, Dr. Harper and Dr. Maj. I think it's gone back to clinic.
Chomping at the bit. Can I put in the stinger for the next one, Marvel movie?
Yes, please.
Style? Yeah, because the next one is going to be all about functional foods and using culinary spices, and Iman's going to walk us through a contextualization of some of these things we were talking about, like how traditional Chinese medicine considers the qualities of food. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be super. And I'll geek out on my taste receptor stuff that I had to shelve for today.
Right.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time, I hope. Bye-bye.